Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. And pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, the chair announces that roll calls may be postponed. Today we'll consider H.R. 676, Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Act of 2023. H.R. 1482, the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2023, and H.R. 1496, the National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act. H.R. 1713, DOE and USDA Interagency Research Act. H.R. 1715, the Advanced Weather Model Computing Development Act, and H.R. 1734, the TRANQ Research Act, and H.R. 1735, Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. I'm excited to kick off our first markup in this Congress and begin moving our legislative agenda. The bills we're considering today span a range of issues and touch a number of agencies within our jurisdiction. They all contribute to a larger effort to improve federal R&D, make it more efficient, and help our science agencies to better serve our communities. The first bill under consideration is H.R. 676, the Coastal Communities Oceanification Act. This bipartisan bill requires NOAA to collaborate with Indian tribes on their work on ocean acidification research and monitoring. Better community engagement with the tribes, as well as state and local government, will improve NOAA's work to support the health and long-term growth of our marine ecosystems. Next up, we have two bills that will help improve our ability to communicate information through extreme weather events. As an Oklahoman, the ability to provide quick and efficient emergency weather communications is especially important to me, particularly as tornado season is gearing up. The more quickly and accurate severe weather, the more lives we can save. So I appreciate my fellow Oklahoman, Representative Bice, for introducing the NOAA Weather Radio Modification Act, which upgrades NOAA's severe weather warning systems. By repairing the transmission sites and antennas, improving signal strength, and establishing backup capacities, this bill ensures that NOAA's weather radio can continue broadcasting emergency warnings straight to homes and businesses across the country. The National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act will also help improve our ability to warn Americans of severe weather. The National Weather Service uses a legacy, custom instant messaging system to communicate with forecast offices and emergency personnel. It was developed decades ago and cannot accommodate the number of people who need to use the system during severe weather events. H.R. 1482 directs NOAA to transition to a commercial, off-the-shelf instant messaging service, which will make communications more efficient and reliable. A number of our members have co-sponsored this bill, and I want to thank you all for your efforts. Next on the docket is the DOE and USDA Interagency Research Act, a bill I've introduced with my colleague, Ranking Member Lofgren. As we discussed at a hearing earlier this month, the Department of Energy is uniquely positioned to advance our knowledge and solve scientific challenges. With its advanced computing capacities, world-class research facilities, and tremendous expertise, DOE can conduct research on cross-cutting issues and help other federal agencies on their scientific priorities. Working with USDA, DOE can help advance crop science, enhance precision agriculture, maximize carbon storage, and improve rural energy infrastructure. Partnerships like this ensure we're making the most of our taxpayers' dollars. Similarly, the Advanced Weather Modeling Computing Development Act codifies the partnership between DOE and NOAA, which will improve our climate modeling and weather forecasting. Accurate predictions require the analysis of extremely large and sometimes very complex data sets, which DOE can conduct with its high-performance computing capacities. Not only can this collaboration improve NOAA's forecasting, but the opportunity to analyze these large data sets will help advance machine learning at DOE. And I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking member of the Environmental Subcommittee, Representative Miller, and Representative Ross for introducing this good government bill. The next bill we'll consider is the TRANQ Research Act, sponsored by Representative Collins, Chairman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee, and Representative Caravillo for broad bipartisan support. Unfortunately, we are all too familiar with the destructive opioids like fentanyl are causing in our communities. But these drugs are being mixed with animal tranquilizers to create deadly new combinations. Drugs like TRIC are presenting new challenges to law enforcement, healthcare professionals, and first responders. Without a better understanding of this drug, we cannot slow its spread, combat its effects, or ensure safe handling. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has already done extraordinary work on fentanyl detection, and this bill allows them to apply their resources and expertise to analyzing these new variants. With NIST's help, we'll improve the ability to detect and identify these drugs and improve the tools available to keep first responders and law enforcement safe when dealing with them. Finally, the last bill we'll consider is the Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act, sponsored by Representative Houlihan and Representative Baird. As someone trained in agricultural economics, I understand the value of conducting mathematical and statistical analysis. This bill will allow us to better teach these skills through R&D into new criteria and teaching methods. A strong STEM pipeline is how America will stay competitive in the decades to come. And I appreciate my colleagues' work to strengthen STEM education within this bill. I'd like to note that all of these bills are bipartisan, were developed through a collaborative process, and I appreciate that we're continuing the Science Committee's practice of bipartisanship. And I hope we can continue to work together on our shared priorities moving forward. I look forward to a productive markup today, and I yield to the ranking member for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm delighted to be here today. You're correct that this markup follows in a long tradition going back decades of bipartisanship in the Science Committee to advance knowledge and serve our country. Like you, I support each one of these bills. H.R. 676 would support the current efforts of coastal communities to address ocean acidification and is well worth our support. The H.R. 1482 and H.R. 1496 both would enhance NOAA's capacity to predict weather events and to communicate that, and is worth our support. I was delighted to join with you, Mr. Chairman, on H.R. 1713. We both represent agricultural districts, and we know how important it is to leverage our science capacity to assist that sector of our economy. 1715, the Weather Model Computing Development Act, which is sponsored by Chairman Miller, will improve coordination, as you said, between DOE and NOAA, and again, is worth our support. I want to just say a moment about H.R. 1734, the TRANQ Research Act. We all deplore the epidemic of drug use, the threat it poses to our citizens. This bill enhances and leverages science to let our first responders and law enforcement know what is in these drugs. There are additions that have been added by drug dealers to enhance, so-called enhance these drugs, and it poses a threat to our first responders, and this will be an important effort to allow our first responders to more safely do their jobs. Finally, 1735, the Mathematical Statistical Modeling Education Act, is a terrific bill, and it would direct the National Science Foundation to invest in research so that we will develop the best curricula possible in this area, and it deserves our support. I want to thank the chair again for working collaboratively with the minority on these bills, and congratulate the members of the committee on both sides of the aisle for working so productively together. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 676, the Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Act of 2023. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 676 to amend the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act of 2009 to require the Secretary of Commerce, acting through the Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself to speak on the underlying bill. H.R. 676, the Coastal Communities Acidification Act of 2023, is a straightforward, no-nonsense bill to make a government program better and more responsive to local concerns. NOAA has already established an interagency working group and conducts the strategic research plan and program research required by the Federal Ocean Acidification Act and Monitoring Act of 2009. And while state and local governments, industry, academia, and other representatives are included in this work, there is no specific call out for Indian tribes. This bill seeks to amend that by updating the statute directing collaboration of these activities to include Indian tribes. Their participation is extremely important because tribal communities live and work on our coast and have used and conserved the ocean's natural resources for thousands of years. While I come from a landlocked state, acidification can happen in freshwater lakes and rivers too. So this is an issue relevant beyond coastal areas. Additionally, I know firsthand that the knowledge and expertise Indian tribes can bring to federal collaboration, including Oklahoma, which has the third largest Native American population in the U.S. These communities can be overlooked, but they have direct knowledge of the effects of acidification, both on the coast and inland, and can be an important resource. It only makes sense that they have a seat at the table and to provide input on research, assessments, and mitigation. The minority tweaks to existing laws proposed by this bill will do just that. It makes sure that Indian tribes are specifically included and that they will be guaranteed avenues for input and participation in federal activities. I want to thank the gentlewoman from Maine, Mrs. Pingree, for introducing the bill, and Mrs. Bonamici for being the Science Committee co-sponsor of it. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time. And do I see a request from the ranking member?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for recognizing me. I want to note that this is a good bill. We should all support it. It makes an important difference, as the chairman has described, certainly for Californians. We have a large number of tribes, especially in Northern California along the coast, who will be of help to us. And at this point, I would like to recognize Ms. Bonamici. Yield my time.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Lofgren, and thank you, Chairman Lucas, for marking up these bipartisan bills today. I'm speaking today in support of H.R. 676, the Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Act of 2023, introduced by Congresswoman Pingree of Maine. This legislation builds upon the ocean acidification activities at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. As more coastal regions across the United States are harmed by ocean acidification, we must continue work to understand the effects and develop mitigation and adaptation strategies. Any effort to understand and address ocean acidification must involve all coastal communities in the United States. Coastal communities will experience acidification in varied ways, and therefore the adaptation strategies and mitigation response will differ. For some communities, ocean acidification could be detrimental to their way of life by decimating fisheries and other blue economy industries that are the foundation of their economy. In fact, I first became aware of the economic consequences of ocean acidification after Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery, now in the district I represent, experienced a significant die-off of oyster larvae caused by unusually acidic waters that corroded the shells of the larvae. They worked with Oregon State University on a mitigation strategy to alter the chemistry of the seawater in hatchery tanks, but ocean acidification remains a very challenging issue. Furthermore, many coastal communities, especially tribes, have vast and historical knowledge of the coastal environment that can add to our understanding of ocean acidification. So this bill improves federal collaboration with state, local, and tribal governments and other coastal stakeholders on ocean acidification research and vulnerability assessments. This is important to further stakeholder engagement, improve our research on ocean acidification, and help all communities adequately prepare for the challenging environment. This bill also requires representation from tribes on the Ocean Acidification Advisory Board and also requires NOAA to maintain the Ocean Acidification Information Exchange to support the data sharing of ocean and climate acidification research, data, and monitoring efforts. I have long advocated for solutions to address ocean and coastal acidification. In fact, in June of last year, my bipartisan TRANQ Research Act was signed into law to help coastal communities adapt to the climate crisis by expanding scientific research, monitoring, and adaptation of ocean and coastal acidification. The bill was signed into law, and it was a great step forward. The basic chemistry of the ocean is changing at an unprecedented rate. Even if carbon dioxide emissions were halted today, many of the residual effects on the ocean would continue over the course of the next few decades. And without intervention, ocean acidification is projected to become more intense and increasingly common, especially on the Pacific coast. We must support vulnerable communities, industries, and coastal and ocean managers by strengthening research on how we can best prepare and, when possible, adapt to ocean and coastal acidification. So I'm an enthusiastic co-sponsor of this bipartisan bill, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation, both in the markup and on the floor, to better prepare coastal communities and economies against the growing threat of ocean acidification. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. And the ranking member yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word. Allow me to say, as a fellow landlocked state member of Congress, actually I could say lake-locked in Michigan, we very much appreciate this bipartisan bill, and this represents the best of Congress, colleagues coming from all over this nation to sponsor this bill and to utilize our Department of Commerce and NOAA to do the assessment, the vulnerability assessment, and very pleased for the inclusion of tribes in this legislation. And I fully support it, and I encourage all of my colleagues to do so, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Anyone else seeking to be recognized? Seeing no one. There were no amendments pre-filed for this bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment now? Hearing none, pursuant to Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1482, the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2023. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1482, to provide guidance for an investment in the upgrade and modernization of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Weather Radio, All Hazards Networks, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at this point. I now recognize Ms. Bice to speak on the underlying bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Lofgren. I am proud to again introduce H.R. 1482, the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act, a bill that passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support last Congress. The National Weather Radio Modernization Act supports, upgrades, and modernizes one of the best alert systems we have for extreme weather and dangerous events. The NOAA Weather Radio All Hazards System, known as NWR, is a highly efficient, nationwide network that broadcasts natural, environmental, and safety alerts to the public through radio broadcast frequencies. It broadcasts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to 95% of the population of the United States. The NWR is life-saving and informative to everyone, no matter their location, but we must ensure it's being utilized to its full potential and upgraded to improve it. Just this past Friday, a tornado outbreak in Mississippi and Alabama took the lives of at least 26 people. Early reporting has informed us that some residents did not hear a siren. That's because sirens are meant for people outdoors and only have a transmission range of about 1 to 2 miles. That means rural communities with houses separated miles apart by private land can be blindsided if they don't have additional alert mechanisms. This is where the handheld, inexpensive NWR device excels. I personally have a device in my home, and many of my constituents heard alerts through their small receivers earlier this month when tornadoes struck just south of Oklahoma City. That's because the National Weather Radio is widely trusted due to its accuracy and long track record of saving lives. It is also consistent and operates even when the power goes out or cell service is down. Simply put, National Weather Radio is the single best source for real-time, comprehensive weather and emergency information. But it was almost 3 decades ago, in the late 90s, that the NWR network received its last upgrade. Since that time, the world has become more digitized, with internet access and smartphones in nearly every household. We must ensure that old but reliable systems like the National Weather Radio don't get lost in the modern era. H.R. 1482 authorizes upgrades and repairs to the existing system and ensures that a reliable infrastructure in place is not abandoned. These timely repairs will also help outages become less common. The legislation also establishes a modernization initiative and paves the way for future broadcast development. This will provide fail-safe options so NWR is never down for an extended period of time and utilizes modern technologies we have to supplement radio broadcast. Last but not least, H.R. 1482 requires NOAA to conduct an assessment of NWR access. This will ensure that the modernization efforts are effective and people across the country have easy, reliable access in a manner that is in line with their way of life. I am proud to have introduced this legislation because it will prevent devastating headlines like we've seen coming from Mississippi. It will directly protect the lives of Oklahomans as well as communities across this nation. I want to thank my colleagues on the committee who co-sponsored this bill, Mr. Miller and Ms. Bonamici. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. And before I recognize the ranking member, I would note to the members of the committee that we will be rolling votes so that when we have a vote series, we can be as efficient with your time as possible. Just bear with us. And with that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to note, as I did in my opening statement, that we strongly support this bill. The gentlelady from Oklahoma mentioned properly the risk that tornadoes pose in her state, but clearly there are weather threats all across the United States, and every state needs this important bill. Passed the House in the last Congress, and we hope that it gets over to the Senate and to the President's desk this year. We commend Ms. Bice for her efforts, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word. I enthusiastically support this bill, and I greatly appreciate your leadership and the leadership of Ms. Bice. I was pleased to see this bill pass last Congress. I think we have a real chance of getting this done. And just as another example to add to the dialogue, we had in northern Michigan a major tornado. We don't have tornadoes in northern Michigan, but we had one in Gaylord. There was no notification system. We saw this in Kansas. These tornadoes are coming faster, and so the systems need to be updated. And so utilizing the prowess of this committee and of this legislation to support technology, to support the assessments, and to allow us to better respond to weather events will make our country safer. So thank you to my colleagues from Oklahoma. I enthusiastically support the bill.
Does any member additionally wish to be recognized to speak? The gentleman's recognized.
I move to strike the last word as well. As a professional meteorologist for nearly a quarter of a century, the National Weather Service radio is such an important part of the communication process to allow our communities to make good decisions, to protect their lives, their families, and their homes. And so I appreciate the gentlewoman from Oklahoma and this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Seeing none, there were no amendments pre-filed for this bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment now? Seeing none, pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1496, the National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1496, to upgrade the communication service used by the National Weather Service and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Crawford to speak on the underlying bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Ranking Member Lofgren as well. I also want to thank Representative Randy Feenstra from Iowa for introducing this bill again this Congress, although he's no longer on the Science Committee and allowed me the opportunity to serve as original co-sponsor. Late Friday night, a supercell weather system set off watches and warnings in my home district of eastern Arkansas before leaving 170 miles of destruction across Mississippi and Alabama. Unfortunately, rural Mississippi received the brunt of damage with an EF4 tornado destroying entire communities and taking the lives of at least 26 people. It's an unfortunate reality that extreme weather events can pop up and take the life of an everyday citizen in just minutes, and these events won't stop in the future. But it's our responsibility as legislators in Congress to ensure federal agencies like NOAA and the National Weather Service are equipped to save lives and property to the best of their ability when they do happen. The bill we're considering now, H.R. 1496, the NWS Communication Improvement Act, seeks to upgrade one of those tools. Severe storms pop up quickly and change directions erratically. Therefore, meteorologists and local emergency officials in potentially affected areas of a country utilize a real-time communication system called NWS Chat to share information and talk to each other. NWS Chat disseminates critical, time-sensitive weather information to broadcasters, emergency managers, and local officials during severe events. It's essentially an instant messaging portal for the live exchange of information and for community leaders to know what's headed their way. Unfortunately, it's an old legacy application developed by NWS staff, not computer scientists or app developers. That's led to multiple occasions in recent years when the entire system has failed in the middle of a dangerous severe weather situation, largely because it just simply can't handle thousands of users at one time. Although NOAA and NWS tend to quickly identify issues with the platform during failures and get full functionality back in a matter of minutes, it's a fact that every second matters during these deadly storms. Any period of communication outage can lead to lost lives. And to their credit, NWS is not sitting idly by. They have identified several systematic upgrades critical to its emergency communications operation, including the need to replace NWS Chat. In fact, in July of 2022, NWS signed a contract to use Slack as the next gen of the NWS Chat service. But H.R. 1496 is still needed as it specifically authorizes that replacement by giving NOAA the authority to transition to NWS Chat to any commercial off-the-shelf solution. It also authorizes the appropriations to do so in the next year and complete the training that's needed for all offices to use it. This type of commercial solution will allow nearly unlimited users, so future growth will not be a problem. It also puts NWS Chat in an agile and resilient posture to take advantage of new technologies as they emerge. Simply put, this is a common sense upgrade that allows the federal government to utilize established technology rather than try to create their own. The sooner we implement this quick and easy solution, the sooner local emergency managers will forget their worries of system failures and lives lost. With this bill, NWS has the full support of Congress to complete this upgrade and can avoid any potential delays. Again, I want to thank Mr. Feenstra for introducing this bill, as well as my fellow Science Committee colleagues who are co-sponsoring it, Mrs. Ross, Mr. Miller, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Sorensen, and Ms. Fauché. I look forward to its passage and encourage all my colleagues on the committee to support it. Thank you, and with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the ranking member seek to be recognized?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note that I fully support this bill. It is truly, if it is enacted, a life-saving measure, and I want to commend the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for authoring this legislation, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? The gentlelady from Michigan.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word. I just would like to politely mention that NWS chat is not chat GDP. So it is not artificial intelligence. This is allowing our weather service professionals to talk amongst themselves and better communicate just like we see in the private sector. I fully support the bill. I thank the ranking member and the chair for their leadership.
Duly noted as the gentlelady yields back. Anyone else seeking recognition? Seeing none. There were no amendments pre-filed for this bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment now? Seeing none, pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1713, the DOE and USDA Interagency Research Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1713, to provide the Department of Energy and Department of Agriculture joint research and development activities, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself to speak on the underlying bill. As we heard earlier this month at a hearing on the U.S. Department of Energy's interagency research partnerships, in light of a growing international competition, there is an urgent need for legislation to ensure federal agencies can continue to collaborate on strategic research that will enhance U.S. competitiveness and economic prosperity for the next generation. My bill, H.R. 1713, the DOE and USDA Interagency Research Act, is just one piece of that effort, but an essential piece nonetheless. This legislation directs DOE and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to carry out cross-cutting research and development activities focusing on the joint advancement of DOE and USDA mission requirements and priorities. It directs the secretaries to conduct collaborative research over a range of focus areas and applications, to develop methods to accommodate large data sets on agriculture, environmental, and supply chain information, and to supply research infrastructure and workforce development. Critically, my bill also requires the secretaries to conduct these activities in a manner consistent with the robust research security provisions this committee worked to pass in the CHIPS and Science Act. We already know that DOE and USDA have a long history of working together on tough research problems to find solutions for the American taxpayers, including farmers and ranchers like myself. By authorizing this partnership, we ensure that the USDA can leverage DOE's tremendous expertise and resources for years to come. In this way, we maximize our return on investments of limited federal research dollars and improve our ability to address national science and technology challenges in key areas like crop science, carbon storage, precision agriculture, and biofuels, among many other areas. This is the kind of common sense, good governance bill we should all agree on. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Lofgren for co-sponsoring this legislation, and I hope my colleagues will support this important bill. And I yield back the balance of my time. Does the ranking member seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, it was a pleasure to work with you on this bill. We all know that every 10 years there's a redistricting process in each state, and the redistricting process in the state of California gave me the lettuce bowl of the world in Monterey, California, and Pajaro and other places. And I have learned how important science and technology is to the agricultural sector. What has been achieved is simply amazing, and this bill will actually advance that further. So I thank the chairman, and with that, I hope that every member will support this bill, and I yield back.
And I would note to the ranking member, with that knowledge now, I will enjoy every salad even more. The ranking member yields back. Does any member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? If there's no further discussion on this bill, we'll proceed with amendments in the order listed on the roster. And the first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Salinas. The clerk will report the Salinas Amendment number 6.
Amendment to H.R. 1713, offered by Ms. Salinas of Oregon.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the gentlewoman, would the ranking member like to be recognized first?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I would like to say I support this amendment and yield to the gentlelady who is the author.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I fully agree with the underlying bill. It is a common sense, good governance bill, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for bringing this forward. So HR 17 directs DOE and USDA to carry out cross-cutting and collaborative R&D activities over 11 focus areas, including biomass and biofuels, rural technology development, development of sustainable transportation fuels, and so on. And my amendment would actually add a 12th focus area, and I think for me, I have a big agriculture area with a lot of forest in it as well, and specifically wildfire risks and prevention, including the power sector's role in fire mitigation and wildfire impacts on energy infrastructure. This is an important addition to the list of focus areas in this bill because there is a significant mission overlap between USDA, including the Forest Service, and DOE in addressing the wildfire electricity grid nexus. As we have seen in our region of the world, the role of the power sector in wildfire management is twofold. On the one hand, power sector must continue to take steps to shore up electricity lines and equipment in order to prevent their assets from causing wildfires. And then at the same time, wildfires remain a major physical threat to power sector infrastructure and reliable electricity services. So the power sector has an interest in actually protecting its assets from wildfire risks. DOE and USDA collaboration in these areas would support the power sector's efforts to bolster grid resilience and reliability amid increasingly intense wildfire seasons. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? I would ask the clerk, in order to make the process flow better, I believe the gentlelady spoke on Amendment 4. Would you call up Amendment 4, and we'll finish consideration of it, and then proceed back to Amendment 6? Seeing no objection from the membership.
Amendment to H.R. 1713, offered by Ms. Salinas of Oregon. Page 4, line 22, strike and.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. And with that, does anyone else wish to speak on Amendment number 4? Obviously, the gentlelady did an exceptional job. Seeing no other request for time, we'll proceed to vote on Amendment number 4. All those by voice, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, the amendment is adopted. Now, the clerk will reread Amendment number 6, and we'll continue with the amendment process.
Amendment to H.R. 1713, offered by Ms. Salinas of Oregon. Page 3, line 7.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a wonderful amendment. I fully support it, and I yield to Ms. Salinas the balance of my time.
Thank you to the ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Clearly, I am showing my freshman stripes this morning, but
There's nothing wrong with an open mind. You are recognized.
thank you. So this amendment would add biological pest control to the list of research focus areas for collaboration between USDA and DOE. Biological pest control involves the use of living organisms to suppress pest populations, which can include introducing or conserving natural predators, parasites, and pathogens. This kind of approach can provide an alternative to traditional pesticide use that is environmentally safe, energy self-sufficient, cost-effective, and sustainable. And both agencies already conduct research in this area, and my amendment would facilitate greater coordination of these efforts. And I'm seeing this in some of my nurseries and horticulture in my district right now, and this collaboration between USDA and DOE can go a long way. In fact, USDA has published a national roadmap for integrated pest management, which seeks to manage and reduce risk from pests and pest management tools and strategies in a way that minimizes overall economic, health, and environmental risks. It calls for coordination between federal agencies, universities, and other local partners to develop and implement effective new approaches. Better biological pest management capabilities will protect farmers and farm workers, improve food security, and limit negative environmental effects associated with pesticide use. And I do ask the committee for their support on this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the Salinas Amendment number 6. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. The amendment is agreed to. There were no other amendments pre-filed for this bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment at this time? Seeing no additional amendments, pursuant to Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1715, the Advanced Weather Model Computing Development Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1715, to direct the Department of Energy and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to conduct collaborative research in order to advance numerical weather.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Miller to speak on the underlying bill.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas. My bill, H.R. 1715, the Advanced Weather Model Computing Development Act, directs the Department of Energy and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to continue partnering on weather prediction, improving climate models, and other related activities. This legislation establishes a dedicated joint NOAA and DOE initiative to support advanced modeling on high-performance computers with a 5-year sunset. It also requires DOE and NOAA to conduct these activities in a manner consistent with the well-vetted and comprehensive research security provisions the Science Committee worked to pass in the CHIPS and Science Act. As chairman of the Environment Subcommittee, I take the Science Committee's responsibility to shape the future of weather forecasts and climate modeling very seriously. It is our job in Congress to identify and strengthen partnerships that will drive the United States' innovation within this space. By working together, DOE and NOAA can combine their respective expertise to solve some of today's most challenging problems in environmental science. By authorizing this partnership, we can ensure these agencies can continue their essential interagency research for years to come. We can also save taxpayer money by sharing mutually beneficial resources instead of building out duplicative capabilities at different agencies. DOE is home to some of the fastest supercomputers and most advanced scientific computing capabilities in the world. It's important that these essential scientific resources are fully deployed to tackle high-priority problems across the federal government and not just within the department itself. That's why this bill establishes the Climate and Weather Prediction on High-Performance Computers Initiative. This joint NOAA and DOE research initiative will enable the advancement of NOAA weather prediction approaches and will accelerate the optimization of weather modeling codes. Utilizing DOE's supercomputers, the meteorologists and weather experts at NOAA will be able to input larger amounts of data and examine the effects of this improved capacity on weather models. The result will equal more accurate and higher quality weather forecasts, which will in turn protect lives and property. In return, this collaboration will improve DOE's advanced data analytics and machine learning abilities by providing the department with access to large and complex weather data sets. Through strategic collaboration, DOE and NOAA provide a strong example of effective and practical interagency R&D. An authorization of this partnership is also a great example of increasing the government efficiency by working across larger federal landscapes. I want to say thank you to my colleague, Representative Ross, for her co-sponsoring this legislation and for her leadership on these very important issues. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Does the ranking member wish to be recognized?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Ross for this legislation. We heard just yesterday about the importance of more fully utilizing the data we get in our weather space. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time to Ms. Ross.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Lofgren, and thank you for holding this important meeting on these bipartisan bills. They are critically important. I'm pleased to co-lead H.R. 1715, the Advanced Weather Modeling Computing Development Act, introduced by my colleague, Congressman Miller of Ohio. The bill builds on the collaborative research partnership between the Department of Energy and NOAA to advance the nation's weather and climate modeling capabilities. Simply put, climate change is causing weather in our communities to become more extreme. We have seen catastrophic flooding in California, deadly tornadoes in Mississippi in just the past week. My home state of North Carolina is particularly vulnerable to extreme weather like floods and hurricanes, which are increasing in frequency and intensity and causing billions of dollars of damage. The importance of improving forecasting and modeling cannot be understated and must be a priority. The bill allows NOAA the ability to tap DOE's high-performance computing capabilities and expertise to conduct collaborative research in developing new methods to advance weather and climate modeling. The bill also works to improve the scientific computing infrastructure between both agencies. These common-sense steps will help us improve our forecasting and modeling capabilities and save lives and properties in communities like mine and across the country. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation to advance numerical weather and climate predictions in the U.S. and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized on this? I believe the gentleman, Mr. Sorensen, does.
I move to strike the last word. As a meteorologist, my congressional district is in an enhanced risk for severe weather, including tornadoes for Friday, as well as much of the central part of the country. The reason that we know about that today is because meteorologists are using computer models to simulate what the weather will bring us on Friday. Too often in the meteorological community, we're seeing that the computer systems in Europe are more accurately forecasting the weather than our own. And so I urge my colleagues to support this. I really appreciate the leadership from Congressman Miller and Rep. Ross, who's sitting next to me, for their leadership, the bipartisanship, and for this move forward in science. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any additional member seeking to speak on this? There, seeing none. There were no amendments pre-filed for this bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment now? Seeing none. Seeing none. Pursuant to House Rule 2F and, Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1734, the TRANQ Research Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1734, to require coordinated National Institute of Standards and Technology Science and research activities regarding illicit drugs.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Collins to speak on the underlying bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Caravello, for leading this bill with me. Also, thank you, Chairman Lucas, Ranking Member Lofgren, and the other members of this committee have joined 21 of their colleagues in co-sponsoring this common sense bipartisan bill. This bill directs the National Institute of Standards and Technology to analyze and advance research on dangerous fentanyl additives that are putting public safety officers' lives at risk, including those guarding our borders. As we've all seen, fentanyl has been entering our country at record levels over the past 2 years. Now we're seeing even more harmful chemicals like TRANQ being added to an already deadly substance. TRANQ is a dangerous substance containing a veterinary tranquilizer, which when combined with fentanyl becomes even more deadlier than the fentanyl itself. The Drug Enforcement Agency reports that between 2020 and 2021, detections of TRANQ and fentanyl increased 198% in the United States. This bill is one step in fighting dangerous fentanyl additives. By understanding what these additives are, how to test for them, and how to safely handle them, we can better protect our responders. This is a common sense bill that will help us better understand the rise of fentanyl additives plaguing our communities. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe the ranking member seeks recognition on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I noted in my original statement, I strongly support this bill, of which I'm an original co-sponsor. It's a great example of how our research agencies can help really, in a very relevant way, our first responders. And with that, I would like to yield to Ms. Caraveo.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Lofgren. I would like to thank you both for holding this markup on the TRANQ Act, and would like to thank my colleague, Representative Mike Collins, for working to introduce this important legislation. As a doctor, I have seen firsthand the horrific impacts of the drug crisis on families. In 2022, over 107,000 Americans lost their lives to drug overdoses. These deaths were driven in large part due to the synthetic opioid fentanyl. This drug has a high potency and is relatively easy to manufacture. Criminals making fentanyl can add different chemicals to change its molecular structure, creating a variant that is novel and difficult to detect. In recent months, criminals have turned to a common animal tranquilizer called xylazine, or TRANQ, to make fentanyl. If injected, this drug can have horrible side effects, including large wounds at the injection site. Xylazine is unfortunately spreading across the country. A recent study by NIST found xylazine in 80% of samples with fentanyl collected from syringe-serve programs in Maryland. While NIST study was conducted on the East Coast, this drug is starting to make its way west. Colorado has already seen 2 xylazine-related deaths, but it's not clear how widespread this problem is. I have seen opioids wreak havoc on our communities in Colorado, so we must act now to stop xylazine in its tracks. One reason why we don't have a better idea of how widespread the problem is in Colorado is due to a lack of testing. A major challenge to combating synthetic opioids is detecting them. Drug mixtures usually contain a very small amount of the drug, and traditional lab methods are not designed to detect or identify new drug variants. The TRANQ Research Act addresses this challenge by leveraging our nation's scientific capabilities to allow our first responders to be able to detect, identify, and better understand synthetic opioids. The legislation directs NIST to develop new methods and partnerships to make it easier and faster to detect drugs containing xylazine and other novel synthetic opioids. It also promotes the development of safe handling processes to ensure the safety of law enforcement officers and forensic chemists. I am proud to partner with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to empower the nation's measurement laboratory and our first responders to tackle the opioid crisis. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on this? I've got to go with With that, I believe the chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
I want to begin by thanking the committee for holding this markup and advancing this slate of bills. I was proud to join many of my colleagues on this committee as an original co-sponsor of the TRANQ Research Act. Like many of my colleagues, my district is plagued with an opioid and fentanyl crisis. This epidemic has claimed too many lives in our community. Within the past month, I was able to participate in a ride-along in Rockford, Illinois, with the State Line Area Narcotics team to hear, to feel, to see, and to understand how this is having an impact in my hometown. And the TRANQ Research Act would direct the National Institutes of Standards and Technology to deepen its partnerships and scientific efforts to combat the spread of opiates such as TRANQ. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back the rest of my time.
The gentleman yields back the rest of his time, or any additional requests for time on the underlying bill. The chair now turns to Ms. Sykes to be recognized.
Thank you, Chair. And first, let me start by thanking the bill sponsors, Congress members Collins and Caraveo, for this really important piece of legislation. It is really important to do so. And Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I want to take a moment to really highlight why this is important, particularly for this country, but also for my community in Ohio's 13th congressional district, as well as in the state of Ohio. We have unfortunately been significantly impacted by the surge of the opioid epidemic, impacting individuals, families, communities, local governments, and all of us in some individual or compacted way. Ohio has seen a very sharp increase in the number of opioid deaths. In 2021, according to Ohio's Attorney General, there was a record 4,500 deaths after a significant drop during the COVID pandemic. That surge increased significantly and again is negatively impacting our communities. And one thing that we have seen is increases in Black communities where we had not seen as many opioid deaths in the past. This research is incredibly important to better understand the properties of how these interact with the human body and the potential risks and harm with their use. We've seen from prescription drugs to heroin to fentanyl to carfentanil, now to this TRANQ. It is incredibly important for us to get ahead of this. So for example, in Ohio, in 2015, 50% of the overdose deaths were related to heroin, and in 2020, only 6% of those deaths were related to heroin. However, fentanyl accounted for 81% of accidental overdose deaths. Research on novel synthetic opioids can help aid in the development of new and more effective treatments for opioid addiction and overdose, and understanding how these work and the mechanisms behind the addiction and overdose, researchers can identify targets, help reduce risk, and develop new medications to prevent and treat opioid use disasters. One of the things I've learned as a student and a practitioner of public health is if it is predictable, it is preventable. And the more information we have about the synthetic opioids, we can prevent people from even becoming addicted in the first place, and making sure that the treatment options are well-researched, well-resourced, and increase the lifespans of many people. So I am wholeheartedly in support of this bill. I am proud to join in the efforts of this. I do hope it makes it not only through this committee, but through this chamber and through the Senate and on to the president's desk, because people throughout our country, but particularly our communities in Ohio's 13th district and beyond, are counting on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? Seeing no request, there is no further discussion on the bill, and we'll proceed with amendments in the order listed on the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Tenney. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1734, offered by Ms. Tenney of New York. Add at the end of the bill the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman from New York is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for holding this markup, and also thank you to Representatives Collins and Caraveo for introducing this bill on TRANQ Research. As everyone knows, the opioid crisis has harmed our communities, destroyed lives, and devastated so many Americans. Over the last 25 years, opioid deaths have risen more than 900%, an almost unfathomable increase. Now, in addition to our previous epidemic of heroin and currently epidemic of fentanyl deaths from synthetic opioids such as the zombie drug xylazine have skyrocketed nationwide since 2020. This has been acutely felt in New York, especially, believe it or not, in my district communities throughout the Finger Lakes and across Lake Ontario. I'm honored to be co-sponsor of this legislation to direct the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to expand its research and focus on the science needed to understand and cease the spread of synthetic opioids. While this legislation is a great first step, my amendment would build on its provisions, requiring the director of NIST to report to this committee on their efforts to implement this legislation. This report will be critical for ensuring that NIST is placing sufficient focus and investment on combating synthetic opioids. Further, this amendment would allow the Director of NIST to include in his report any legislative recommendations to improve implementation of the Act. It's important that we know expeditiously about any regulatory or funding hurdles preventing NIST from focusing on synthetic opioids. Only through timely and informed action can we start to lessen this scourge of opioids in our communities. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment, and thank you again to the co-sponsors and to everyone for supporting the bill and my amendment. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a common sense amendment. It's important to ensure oversight of the program that's being authorized in the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? The gentlelady from Michigan seeks recognition. And
Mr. Chair, I would also like to vocalize my support for this amendment and Ms. Tenney's leadership, particularly her familiarity with the equine industry, and to also voice my support for the entire underlying bill. TRANQ is spooky stuff. We are seeing this come into communities, the burns that are resulting, the lack of understanding of treatment, and frankly, why this is coming into our communities. And for those committee members who are new to this very body, NIST is such a powerful agency, and the fact that we are going to be able to utilize NIST and their work in public-private partnerships to identify solutions is quite powerful and determinative of good solutions to tackle the proliferation of TRANQ in our communities and the overall fentanyl crisis. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. I support the amendment.
the gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, seeing none. Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Tenney. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings will be postponed. There were no other amendments pre-filed for the bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment at this time? Seeing none, pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11, proceedings on this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, before I ask the clerk to call up the bill, I would note to all of my colleagues, I believe this is the last amendment in the last bill in the markup. We have approximately 4 amendments. It would be my goal, and I believe the ranking member's goal, that by the time we finish this bill, we be prepared to do our series of 7 roll call votes and finish our work for the day. So all of you are here, please stay with us, and all of those wonderful staffers out there, please alert your wonderful bosses to be here in short notice. With that was politely done, wasn't it, ranking member?
Absolutely.
With that, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1735, the Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1735, to coordinate federal research and development efforts focused on modernizing mathematics and STEM education through mathematical and statistical modeling.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to first thank Ms. Houlihan and Mr. Baird for working on this legislation for the second Congress in a row. I very much hope we can get the bill over the finish line in this Congress. It's an important effort, and I yield back my time.
Does anyone else seek recognition to speak on the underlying bill? Seeing none, seeing none. If there is no further discussion on this bill, we will proceed with the amendments in the order listed on the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute that's been pre-filed with the committee and offered by the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1735, offered by Mr. Baird. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the gentleman from Indiana is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I appreciate all of you taking the time on this committee to hear this bill. And I appreciate the staff for helping work with this bill. It's called Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act. And this is an important bill that I was proud to reintroduce with my friend from Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan. She has been a great partner, and I'm hopeful we'll be able to get the job done this Congress. The Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act provides a much-needed solution to improving the quality of STEM education in America. This measure advances mathematical instruction by incorporating modern tools and context, including data, statistics, and computation. Mathematical modeling is currently taught at a limited basis, yet is the foundation for the important work our nation is doing when it comes to research, development, and technological innovation. In addition to being both a bipartisan and a bicameral piece of legislation, this bill has the support of several organizations, including the American Mathematical Society and the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. Last Congress, this bill was overwhelmingly passed by the House of Representatives, and we are here to keep that momentum. Given the prior success, we need to be careful about major changes to this bill that will make it more difficult to see it passed into law. I'm proud to help lead this effort in providing the security of Americans' global competitive edge. Knowledge is power. Therefore, understanding and making the best use of data is power. America has historically dominated in the STEM fields, but our prominence is increasingly being challenged, and we risk falling behind. That's not something any of us really want to see happen. Now I have a background in animal science, so I understand the importance of research and how it promotes innovation to provide for a better tomorrow. Research may not be something you see big changes right away, but investigating and investing in its fundamental for long-term success of the country and the STEM fields are a critical part of that. This legislation is one way to help keep America on top, and we owe it to our students to give them the tools and the instructions necessary to prosper. Additionally, one key aspect of this bill is that it does not authorize any new spending, but directs current funding towards these goals. This amendment, in the nature of a substitute, makes some important and technical changes to the underlying bill. The amendment makes sure that when we refer to STEM, we are including science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and computer science. It also ensures the language in the bill is consistent with previous National Science Foundation authorizing legislation. And lastly, these changes ensure that this bill is in compliance with House floor protocols. I want to thank Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren's staff for working with me on this amendment, and I strongly encourage all of my colleagues to join me in supporting it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his comments, and he yields back. I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. It's important that this bill comply with the new protocols of this Congress. We want it to pass, and obviously inclusion of computer science is very important. I support the amendment. I yield back.
Lady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on Mr. Baird's amendment? Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Since this is an amendment in the nature of a substitute, we'll now move to the next amendment on the roster. The next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1735, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is very simple. It simply ensures that faith-based homeschools and private schools are included in the STEM grant program.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The author of the amendment has described what this would do, but I think it's important to clarify the impact. We all know that there are policy differences between members of Congress about whether or not federal funds should flow to private schools and homeschools. There is a policy disagreement, but that's not what this amendment is about. The grants go to universities, and what this does is allow for the development of curricula that will advance this education. NIST already includes in its research components not only traditional public schools, but other educational environments. And so this would actually be in keeping with current policy. It doesn't provide funding to the schools that have been mentioned, but simply includes them in the development of curricula, because we want everybody, no matter where that student is learning, to be able to learn effectively. So I think it's important to support the amendment, because it's not actually the disagreement that exists among members of Congress on the other policy issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Hearing none, the question on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Posey, all in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. The amendment is agreed to. And seeing no request for roll call, we'll now proceed to the next amendment. The third amendment on the roster is offered by the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens. The clerk will report the revised amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1735 ANS, offered by Ms. Stevens of Michigan.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and I believe the ranking member's recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is an important an amendment, and it certainly, there are many parts of our country that have not successfully been included in STEM education. As I mentioned before, I now have half of my district is a very rural district, and many of the people who live in rural communities have not been fully accommodated in our important STEM workforce. This would address that issue, and I yield the balance of my time to the author, Ms. Stevens.
The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to offer this amendment to H.R. 1735, the Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act, introduced by my good friend, Dr. Jim Baird, who I passed the Building Blocks of STEM Act with in our first year in the Congress, and alongside the Women in STEM co-chair, Chrissy Houlihan. Last month in our committee hearing, the United States, China, and the fight for global leadership, building a U.S. national science and technology strategy, we heard critical testimony from our panel of remarkable witnesses on the steps that we need to take to ensure that the United States is leading in science and technology. And we heard our experts stress time and time again the importance of increasing our STEM workforce as key to the future of U.S. scientific research enterprise leadership. And frankly, we recall when this committee, on unanimous consent, passed the NSF for the Future Act, we heard from a global network of researchers that we need to do more to not leave American talent behind. We heard this from researchers all over this country. And so as the National Science Foundation and the National Science Board have issued urgent calls to increase the U.S. STEM talent pool in order for our country to maintain its position, empowering students from underrepresented and under-resourced backgrounds, which has been dubbed by the science community the missing millions. This will help us meet our goals. This will help us advance, and this will improve our nation. And so expanding the STEM pool is certainly bipartisan. It is something that this committee has acted on in the past in a bipartisan way. And this is why I'm introducing this amendment, to reduce the gaps, to access mathematical modeling, educational learning opportunities, for students from groups historically underrepresented in STEM. We need to bring in women into the STEM field. We need to bring in students from low economic backgrounds into STEM. We need to bring students from rural areas into STEM. And frankly, when 1 in 20 scientists and researchers are women of color, Black or Latina, that's a problem. We want to increase those numbers as well. And so as a co-chair of the Bipartisan Women in STEM Caucus, I know that the STEM fields play a critical role in ensuring the United States continues to lead globally in research and innovation. That is by bringing all parties to the table. And I certainly implore our colleagues in this committee to support my amendment, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your leadership.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself. I would simply note the previous amendment, this amendment, and the next amendment are about expanding our STEM workforce, which is facing significant shortages. The committee has consistently used the terms students from groups historically underrepresented in STEM. This doesn't specify one group. It includes all Americans who have been overlooked and under-resourced, whether you're from the panhandle of Oklahoma or the inner city of Detroit. I support these amendments. I yield back. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Hearing no others, the question is on agreeing to the revised amendment number 7 offered by Ms. Stevens. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to the voice vote, they passed. The 4th amendment on the roster is offered by the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Salinas. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1735, offered by Ms. Salinas of Oregon.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. We discussed the need in Ms. Stevens' amendment. This amendment is very important, and it really complements the amendment from Ms. Stevens, and I would yield the balance of my time to Congresswoman Salinas.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your endorsement of the 3 amendments, and thank you to the ranking member. As she stated, I think the distinction here is that this amendment really is focused on research on new innovations for some of those communities and those who have been underrepresented. So in the past 2 years, Congress has enacted major investments in the technologies and industries of the future. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act represent a down payment on the next phase of America's innovation economy. But in order to achieve the ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves, we have to prepare the next generation of workers. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, companies across industries, many in my own district, face a shortfall of up to 300,000 engineers and 90,000 skilled technicians by 2030. Expanding and improving education in critical STEM fields such as mathematical and statistical modeling is absolutely essential. We also need to make sure that all Americans are able to take advantage of these new opportunities regardless of their background. And as we look at ways to improve STEM education and workforce development, we should remember that STEM employment gaps still exist for traditionally underrepresented groups. And according to the National Science Foundation's Women, Minorities, and Persons with Disabilities report, women still make up only 1/3 of the STEM workforce. and Hispanic and Black workers continue to be underrepresented in these fields, despite recent progress. So my amendment would encourage researchers to consider whether the educational approaches they develop are actually effective for all students, including those from groups historically underrepresented in STEM. This will help to ensure that NSF investments are used efficiently and can effectively broaden participation in critical STEM disciplines. A student's gender, race, ethnicity, or whether they grow up in a rural town or an immigrant family should not prevent them from competing for good jobs in the STEM economy of the future. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Hearing no other request, the question is agreeing on the amendment offered by Ms. Salinas. All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Rule 2, There are no other amendments pre-filed for the bill. Does any member wish to offer an amendment at this time? Hearing none, there will be a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. The Baird substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. The substitute is adopted. Do you have a problem doing final on this bill since we're at this point in the quorum? Okay. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 1735 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida. The gentleman has requested a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll on H.R. 1735.
Mr. Posey.
Aye.
Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber.
Aye.
Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin. Aye. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Garcia.
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice.
Aye.
Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Isa. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke.
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin.
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong.
Aye.
Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick.
No, don't go to that one.
Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman. Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen. Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas. Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi.
Aye.
Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes. Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost. Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo. Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Chairman.
Aye. Anyone else need to have their vote recorded?
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 32 and the nays are 0.
The clerk has reported the vote. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move that the bill H.R. 1735 be favorably reported to the House, and staff will be authorized to make any necessary and technical and confirming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on this measure. We'll now proceed to consider the postponed votes. A recording quorum being present, the question is now on the bill H.R. 676. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The bill, the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, request recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Garcia.
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice. Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke.
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin.
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong.
Aye.
Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman. Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen. Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas. Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi. Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes. Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost. Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo. Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Chairman.
Aye. And before the clerk reports the vote, does anyone need to be recorded or to change their vote? The gentleman from Florida. Mr. Webster.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 35 and the nays are 0.
The clerk, did Mr. Webster actually say aye for the recorded vote?
Mr. Webster votes aye on the recorded vote.
Say aye, Mr. Webster. My lie's simpler. Thank you. The ayes have it. The bill is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move that H.R. 676 be favorably reported to the House, and the staff be authorized to make any necessary and technical and confirming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 calendar days to submit the supplemental or minority or additional views on this measure. And before we proceed to call the next vote, I just note to my colleagues on the committee that the processes we go through to verify things as they go to the floor are just something that's necessary. So we will try very hard to make sure everyone is appropriately consulted and voted. That said, a reporting quorum being present, the question is now on H.R. 1482. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida.
Request for recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey.
Aye.
Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber.
Aye.
Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice. Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Isa. Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke.
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney. Aye. Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin.
Aye.
Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici.
Aye.
Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman. Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen. Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas. Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi. Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes. Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost. Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo. Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan. Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
And before the clerk reports the vote, does anyone need to have their vote recorded or would like to change their vote? A gentleman is recognized.
McCormick, aye.
Mr. McCormick votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 36 and the nays are 0.
The ayes have it, and the bill appears to be adopted as the, without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the bill H.R. 1482 be favorably reported to the House and the staff be authorized to make necessary technical and confirming changes. Without objection so ordered, members will have 2 calendar days to submit supplemental, minority, and additional views on this language. A reporting quorum being present, the question now is on the bill H.R. 1496. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, request recorded vote.
A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey. Aye. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber. Aye. Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin.
Aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster.
Aye.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice. Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Isa. Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke.
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin.
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick votes aye. Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen? Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas? Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi? Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes? Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost? Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo? Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Anyone else need to have their vote recorded or would like to change their vote? Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 36 and the nays are 0.
The ayes have it. The bill is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the bill H.R. 1496 be favorably reported to the House. Staff be authorized to make any necessary and technical and confirming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 calendar days to submit the supplemental, minority, and additional views on this measure. A reporting quorum being present, the question now is on the bill H.R. 1713 as amended. Those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida seeks recognition.
Request to record a vote, Mr. Chairman.
A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin?
Aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird?
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Garcia? Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice? Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Tenney? Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Zinke?
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong? Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick? Mr. McCormick votes aye. Mr. Collins?
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane? Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici?
Aye.
Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen?
Aye.
Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas? Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi? Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes? Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost? Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo? Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Anyone else need their vote recorded or would like to have their vote changed? The clerk will report the vote when ready.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 36 and the nays are 0.
The ayes have it. The bill is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move that the bill H.R. 1713 be as amended, be favorably reported to the House, and the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection so ordered, members will have 2 calendar days to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. A reporting quorum being present, the question now is on the bill H.R. 1715. Those in favor say aye. All those opposed, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, request a recorded vote.
A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Babin?
Aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird?
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice? Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke?
Aye.
Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney? Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong? Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick? Mr. McCormick votes aye. Mr. Collins?
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici?
Aye.
Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen? Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas? Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi? Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes? Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost? Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo? Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Anyone else who needs their vote recorded or would like to change their vote? The clerk will report the vote when prepared.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 36 and the nays are 0.
The ayes have it, the bill is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the bill H.R. 1715 be favorably reported to the House. The staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and confirming changes, and without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 calendar days to submit supplemental, minority, and additional views on this measure. Our reporting quorum being present, the question now is on the bill H.R. 1734 as amended. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Request recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Posey? Aye. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Weber, aye. Mr. Babin? Aye. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Baird?
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Webster?
Yay.
Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Bice? Ms. Bice votes aye. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke votes aye. Ms. Tenney? Ms. Tenney votes aye. Mr. Franklin? Mr. Franklin votes aye. Mr. Strong? Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. McCormick? Mr. McCormick votes aye. Mr. Collins?
Aye.
Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Bonamici?
Aye.
Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Mr. Sorensen? Mr. Sorensen votes aye. Ms. Salinas? Ms. Salinas votes aye. Ms. Fushi? Ms. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Jackson? Mr. Jackson votes aye. Ms. Sykes? Ms. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Frost? Mr. Frost votes aye. Ms. Caraveo? Ms. Caraveo votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Ms. McClellan? Ms. McClellan votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Caston? Mr. Caston votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Anyone else need to have their vote recorded or would like to change their vote? And the clerk will call the vote when prepared.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 36 and the nays are 0.
The ayes have it, and the bill is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move that the bill H.R. 1734 as amended be favorably reported to the House and the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection so ordered, the members will have 2 calendar days with which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on this measure.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman?
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was coming from another committee and didn't realize how efficient you were going to be this morning. So I request unanimous consent that I could add my yes vote for H.R. 1735.
Since this is the first markup of the season, and we're all adjusting to my style, the chair is willing to accept that UC request if the membership, if there is no objection.
Mr. Chairman, I unanimously support that and add my name to that list.
Is there anyone else who needs to be added to that? The gentleman from Florida, Mr.
Chairman, I do too. I asked that my name be added as a yay.
The chair notes that 3 of our colleagues have asked by unanimous consent to be added in the affirmative to that roll call vote. Again,
Mr. Chairman, let it be known that the Army is late.
that said, seeing no objection to the request for the 3 members, seeing none, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there is no, sorry. Would the clerk read back the name of the 3 members and state the the bill that they are now recorded as voting in the affirmative for the record? Should be the first one we considered, I believe. 1735.
Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Mr. Fleischman.
Who seeks point of order? Add the gentleman's name to the list. If we're going to extend courtesies, we're going to apply them to everybody.
Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick votes aye. Ms. Bonamici.
Aye.
Ms. Bonamici votes aye.
When prepared, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 37 and the nays are 0.
The bill clearly passes. There is no further discussion. That completes our business. This concludes the full committee markup. The committee is now adjourned. Thank you all.
I have the timestamp on them.